Great Lakes Prepping here. In this video, I want to talk about one of the most common food preservation methods out there, and that's freezing. Now, in light of the pandemic and a lot of people stocking up on food because there's been shortages and a lot of fluctuations in prices on things like meat and vegetables, I think freezing has become more popular than maybe ever. I'm certainly freezing more than I was a year ago. Like I said, if I see a sale price, I'm stocking up on some meats, frozen vegetables, all sorts of stuff, even bread. You might remember early on in the pandemic when panic buying was going crazy. It was hard to even find a lot of bread on the shelves at the grocery store. So I've been stocking up a little bit more than usual, and freezing a lot of these items is a completely viable and effective and convenient way to make sure that I have plenty in my food stores. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 5 tips for freezing food for short, medium, or even long term. Tip number 1, double bagging. Freezer burn is one of the biggest enemies of freezing food for storage, and one of the biggest issues with freezing bread that I've found, and as have a lot of people, is freezer burn. If you buy a standard sort of cheap loaf of bread, it comes in one of these ordinary bread bags. Some of the fancier breads and certain brands, they'll actually have the loaf of bread shrink wrapped in an inner sealed bag and then wrapped in the normal bread bag. Now, if you buy bread that comes cellophane shrink wrapped as well as in a normal bag, that's perfect. That freezes really well. I've got bread that I'm still pulling out of the freezer after months. That's perfect. Let it thaw out on the counter. It's great. It works for toast, sandwiches, anything. It thaws out just fine. This sort of packaging, it works, but it's not as good. When I pulled this out of the freezer, I could see a freezer burn on the bread. That means that there's essentially water just sitting on the bread once it gets to room temperature. So, in the next couple days, I could use this just fine, but the texture on some of the pieces, it's a little mushier, and I expect that this is going to start getting moldy a lot faster than if it had not been freezer burned. So double bagging, anything that you're really worried about getting freezer burn on that you can't really vacuum seal. Vacuum sealing is great, but if I were to put bread in a vacuum seal bag, it would become completely squished and deformed and flattened and just all around ruined. So for your loaf of bread like this, or really any other foods that are at risk of freezer burn, just double bag them. For the bread, you could take this right here, wrap it up in another bag, maybe an old bread bag, maybe a great big Ziploc bag if you have one that it'll fit in. Or you could take the bread out from this bag, put them in a few Ziploc bags. That seems a little wasteful, but it would work. Then wrap that whole thing back up in the original bag. Just get a couple layers of packaging on it, and that really makes all the difference when it comes to freezer burn ruining your food. And speaking of vacuum sealing, that brings us to tip number 2. If you haven't gotten into vacuum sealing for food storage, freezer or otherwise, it's fantastic. I use it for all manner of meats, of course, but also a lot of vegetables. Here we've got some of my deer sausage from last year's hunting season. Perfectly sealed, vacuumed into this bag. It's been in the freezer ever since. I'm still going through it because I got an awful lot of these. And it's going to be just as good as the day I put it in there. But also, certain vegetables. I vacuum sealed and froze a bunch of my fresh green beans that I harvested this week. And these are going to be great for months out. Got them in these little sort of single serving portions. It's great. Saves room. You can really preserve your food a lot longer when it doesn't get freezer burned. There's no oxygen in the packaging. It's just all around a more effective and efficient way. Tip number 3, date everything. If you're going to store something that's in the original packaging from the store, it's probably already got a best by date on it. But I also recommend writing on there the date that you put it in the freezer. That's just good to know. I put the date on this little label for my deer sausage, November of 2019. And, sometimes I just use a magic marker and I got it scribbled on the bag with these beans. Just depends if I feel like digging out the label maker or not. But if you label everything, you'll always kind of have an idea of how old it is. Generally, stuff in the freezer can be safe to eat indefinitely. But when I'm going through digging out what I want, just as a matter of good practice, I want to use the stuff that has the oldest date on it. I want to use that first. First in, first out. Tip number 4, fill your freezer up. Fill it up as much as you can. A full freezer is a more efficient freezer. It doesn't have to circulate as much cold air around, and you'll use less electricity, and your food will stay frozen better. I'm not just making that one up. That's not me speaking from personal experience so much as that's what everything you could read on the subject will tell you. That's what refrigeration experts will tell you. Fill the freezer up. And that really leads me right into tip number 5. And this is sort of more of a personal preference, but there's good reason behind it. And that is, rather than having one gigantic chest freezer somewhere in your house, I think it's a better idea to have multiple smaller freezers. Currently, I've got a couple of the more compact 5.5 cubic foot deep freezers, and I could have, for that price, bought one much larger freezer. But between those 2 freezers and the freezer that's part of my regular refrigerator in the kitchen, I've got lots and lots of space, and I look at it as a fail-safe. If one of my freezers dies, chances are the other one's not going to die at the same time. So rather than risk losing all that food all at once, if that thing was to die when I leave for work in the middle of summer, by the time I get home, everything in it's going to be, it's not going to be ruined, but it's going to have thawed out quite a bit in that time, and I'm not necessarily going to feel comfortable refreezing it. If I'm out of town for a couple of days, forget about it. It's all lost. Also, if one of them does start to fail and I can fit more stuff into it, I can unload some or all of the food from the freezer that's failing, put it into the good freezer while I take care of replacing or fixing the broken one. It's just really in the philosophy of 2 is 1, 1 is none. Between those 2 smaller freezers and my refrigerator's freezer, I've got more space than I think I could use, and I've got that redundancy, and that makes me feel more secure and more prepared. So that's it. A pretty straightforward video. I know I could talk all day about how I freeze things, what I freeze, what methods I use for preparing, but it's pretty straightforward, and that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.